It's impossible to talk about the original PlayStation's rise to power without talking about Squaresoft. One of Sony's biggest wins in the console wars was persuading Square to abandon its old ally Nintendo and its outdated cartridge format in favour of working exclusively with Sony, creating games that showcase both the power of the console and how much more you could do with the CD format. And I think it's safe to say they did pretty well, with Final Fantasy VII releasing in 1997 to global critical acclaim, pretty much cementing the PlayStation as the horse to back in the race for the top. And if you can imagine, Final Fantasy VII was only Square's second release on the PlayStation. In total, Square published nearly 50 games in the console's lifespan, from some of the most highly regarded RPGs of all time to weird fighting games and even weirder racing games. Square wasn't just a one-trick RPG pony on the PlayStation. Their games continue to this day to offer some of the most varied and high-quality experiences you can find on the console. So it's a shame that a huge number of these games never made their way over to the West. And it's an even bigger shame if you, like me, grew up in Europe where Square decided to release even less games. Yeah, we got mainline Final Fantasy games and Front Mission 3, but here's just a small list of games we were the proud of in Europe. Xenogears, Chrono Cross, Brave Fencer Musashi, Chocobo Dungeon, Chocobo Racing, Parasite Eve, Bushido Blade 2, and if you can believe it, Final Fantasy Tactics. Come on, Square, that's just cold. So imagine my surprise years later when I first got a computer with internet access and discovered all of these lost Square games that I just never even knew existed. It genuinely blew my dumb kid mind. So over the years I made sure to make time to play through plenty of these lost Square classics, many of which have since become some of my favourite games on the PS1. But one of these games in particular always stuck with me. A game that is not only unlike any other game Square has made, but in my opinion at least, is one of the best games the company has ever produced. So I think it's time we put some respect on its name. This is Square's most underrated PS1 game, Einhander. Einhander was released on the PlayStation in Japan towards the end of 1997 before making its way over to the US in 1998. This is Squaresoft's attempt at a side-scrolling space shooter, or shmup for short. The genre holds a high place in the annals of gaming history, with the granddaddy of all shmups, Space Invaders, pretty much being the catalyst for the modern gaming industry as we know it. Shmups were a mainstay in arcades and homes throughout the 70s, 80s and 90s, but it was interesting to see Square, a company known for its RPG output, trying their hand at a genre that was completely new to them, especially since it was on the PlayStation, and by this stage, shmups were kind of starting to lose their mainstream appeal in favour of flight games featuring full 3D movement and bigger maps to explore. Out with the old and in with the new, as they say. But in spite of Square's newcomer status to the genre, they pretty much created one of the genre's crown jewels on their very first attempt. Now at first glance, Einhander looks a lot like any old side-scrolling shooter. You control a small ship on a 2D plane as the screen scrolls along, and your job is to shoot down as many enemies as possible using a variety of different weapons, while also avoiding a barrage of hazards and enemy fire in the process. That's a shmup, alright. So what is it that makes Einhander special? Well, for one thing, this game actually has a story, and a pretty good one at that. Now, I'm not going to pretend like the story is some massive part of the game, as it's still a shoot 'em up after all, and gameplay is king. But Square made sure to add in just the right amount of story to get you engaged in the world. The game takes place in a fictional future where the Third World War actually takes place between humans on planet Earth and humans on the moon, which resulted in most of the Earth's surface being destroyed by the moon's forces. The fallout from planet Earth's shattered state later resulted in the creation of a totalitarian regime on Earth, which also results in the entire planet's population later adopting German as their native language. The game starts out even further in the future though, during the Second Moon War, where the moon attacks the Earth again with the goal of capturing its natural resources, or what's left of them anyway. The moon's plan is to use a squad of highly trained pilots in experimental fighter ships whose job it is to essentially just wreak havoc on the Earth's military and defenses in what is pretty much a kamikaze mission. Do as much damage as possible before you inevitably die in an honourable death. So then the moon's full forces can then come in and dominate the weakened planet Earth. And you are one of these pilots. I'll expand on the story later, but this is pretty much all we need to know for now. So let's get into gameplay. Now, when you start, you'll have the choice of 3 different ships to pilot. These each have their own individual names and gimmicks, but the defining feature of each of these ships is this: the Manipulator arm. The Earth dubs these attacking ships as Einhanders, which is the German for one-armed or one-handed. Big spaceship with a weird arm, that's what we call an Einhander. Now for the most part, your ship control is very similar to a traditional side-scroller. You can move in 8 directions and control the speed of your ship by using the L2 and R2 buttons to either slow or speed up your ship's movement, denoted by a cool little visual of your ship's boosters opening or closing. As far as the movement goes, everything is crisp and tight, just as you'd hope. Your choice of weaponry is where things get a little more interesting. You do have access to a basic infinite machine gun, which is always reliable in a pinch, but where the game begins to shine is in the use of your ship's manipulator arm. You see, since your ship is designed to fight indefinitely until it's defeated, they needed to find a way to keep it armed indefinitely. So as you defeat your enemies in-game, your arm can actually capture and utilize enemy weaponry. So if you take out a target, mosey on over to them, and then bam, you've got a new big Vulcan minigun, or a shotgun, or a cannon, missile launcher, railgun, even a laser sword. You name it, your arm can use it. Not only is this really damn cool, but it means there's a huge variety of different weapons at your disposal, and cooler still is that your arm can position these weapons in a number of different ways to great effect. For example, with the basic Vulcan minigun, you can have it above to fire straight on, or you can angle it below you to fire at a downwards angle. The spread gun can of course fire directly ahead, but you can also turn it behind you to take out enemies from the rear. The missile launcher actually swaps attack mode, with the lower option using powerful straight firing rockets, or when used above they change to homing missiles, great for taking out smaller scattered enemies or groups. These enemy weapons are ammo dependent, and it is just a small sample of the weapons and modes that are on offer, but take into consideration that your default ship can also swap freely between 3 different enemy weapons at a time, as well as your always available basic fire, and your ship lives up to its reputation to striking fear into the hearts of those who come across it. Now keep in mind, this is just one of the 3 ships available to you. This 3-weapon ship is the game's default option, but there is also a beginner-friendly ship that features just 1 weapon slot but gives you a stronger and more consistent basic fire. So if constantly swapping and managing weapons sounds stressful, then this is probably the ship for you. Or if swapping and managing weapons sounds like fun, you can opt for the advanced ship, which allows you to equip 2 enemy weapons simultaneously, leading to some pretty busted combinations of weaponry. The downside is, with 2 weapons equipped, you lose access to your machine gun, and weapon management becomes much more important, so it's just an extra layer of things to worry about while you're desperately trying not to die. And this is Einhander's main gameplay gimmick, utilizing your enemy's own weapons against them to overcome the insurmountable odds ahead of you. It's really fun, really cool, and also incredibly challenging. Einhander doesn't sugarcoat its difficulty. This game, in a word, is unforgiving. It's a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up true and true, a single hit from an enemy connecting on your ship and boom, you're dead. You can sometimes block enemy attacks using weapons you picked up, but other than that there's no shield or health boosts here. Plus if you die, you don't respawn where you died either, you'll get sent back to a checkpoint earlier in the level, needing to fight through again. There's no infinite lives or continues either, you mess up enough times and you're donezo, back to the beginning to try all over again. So while this is a game that definitely rewards good reflexes, memorization of enemy placement is just as important here. And I can see the game's difficulty being a big barrier of entry to a lot of people, but I think the difficulty is needed to really drive home the story of you being this kamikaze going up against incredible odds, because it oftentimes feels like this game's impossible to overcome, until eventually it's not. And in the same way tackling a boss in a Souls game might be frustrating the first few times you try it, beating a section or boss in Einhander offers the same level of gratification, just in more bite-sized chunks. Einhander doesn't just shine in its brutally satisfying gameplay though, the game's visuals have also held up quite well, especially considering this is one of the earlier 3D shoot-'em-ups on the console. The game starts out with you playing through a dark, colourful utopian city with advertisements in German and bright billboards, but quickly moving into darker and murkier military bases and barren locales, really showing the awful state that the Earth is in thanks to the Great War all those years ago. This is a dark, gritty game, completely reflecting the state of the world that you're in, and getting to visit these war-torn and militaristic locales as the enemy is a great dynamic to experience. The game also takes advantage of its 3D engine, utilizing plenty of dynamic camera angles during different scenes, which you'd think would be disorientating, but since you're still operating on a 2D plane, they are very easy to manage and they even lend to some unique and interesting boss patterns, with enemies jumping in and out of the foreground, forcing you to always keep on your toes. And oh my god, the bosses. This game has some of my favourite boss battles in any shoot 'em up. These are very tough, but oh so satisfying. Bosses have numerous weapons and parts on their body, and you have the ability to destroy each of these individually, so you can literally tear down a boss to its core and demolish it. It's so cool. And the design and patterns of these things are fantastic. One minute you're fighting this giant mechanical monstrosity with a chain gun and flamethrower, before moving on to a mech in this weird room that keeps rotating around with the robot, before then moving on to whatever this thing is with the big dangly arms and the laser tail. There's so much here. There's so many great fights and moments in this game, but the real star of the show, in my opinion, is the game's incredible music and sound design. We need to give a special shout out to composer Kenichiro Fukui, who is probably most well known for being the keyboard player in Nobuo Uematsu's instrumental hard rock band, the Black Mages. But seriously, this in my mind is without a doubt one of the console's finest soundtracks, and Kenichiro Fukui deserves way more recognition for this thing. The music perfectly captures the atmosphere of this game, whether it's trying to slow things down with more ambient tracks, or if it wants to get your blood pumping with intense high-tempo tracks. But above all else, this game's boss music is by far my favorite boss music in any shoot 'em up game, hands down. And it's not just one track, there's plenty, and every single one is amazing. Look, I don't want to spend all day just sitting here playing the game's soundtrack for you, because I easily could, and it would take up 90% of the video if I did that. But seriously, like, look at how the game even transitions you into a boss fight. It's so cool. The build up, the camera angle, the big robot voice calling out in German, which is just the coolest thing. And then this absolute banger of a track, just getting you into the zone. It's amazing. And better yet, if the fight goes on long enough, the song begins to introduce a rapping segment too.
Check it out. It's a lyrical paragraph, it's like make you laugh. You follow the microphone, you did pass math. Science to me, green, the finest of the fit. You did it, you're high with it. You failed all the rest, wanna raise the top 10. Stop looking, let me get fast to the light. Knowledge is the key to be the best of a black man. Wisdom understand the ways of a dust.
It's so good. Every boss gets an opening like this, by the way, with each one featuring its own German dialogue. It's just the little touches like this, the narrative and world building, the equally atmospheric and blood pumping soundtrack, and the crisp, high octane gameplay. It all just combines together to make this game such an absolute joy to play. It's a game that's constantly firing on all cylinders, and it's a perfect example of a title that pushes a genre to new levels, taking full advantage of its system's more powerful hardware, and then using that to enhance the gaming experience as a whole. I just love it. Now we're going to talk about the end of the game here, so spoiler warnings I guess. You wouldn't think a shoot 'em up would have spoilers, but this one kinda does, so you've been warned, I suppose. Towards the end of the game we get a mission to destroy a rocket that's been launched by Earth's forces towards the moon. Up until this point the story usually gets updated to you briefly at the end of each mission from your command team on the moon. All allied dialogue is in English by the way, and in this mission your allied support is unable to help you, so it's up to you to stop this rocket reaching the moon. Which brings us to the Square classic, a time section. Your goal here is to destroy the 2 engines on the rocket, which of course since it's Einhander is much easier said than done. If you fail to destroy the engines within the time limit, you actually activate the game's bad ending, which sees you fall helplessly into enemy territory before they ultimately finish you off. Grim. If you manage to destroy the rockets though, the game takes quite the twist. Your command team gets in touch with you to confirm that you've successfully completed your mission, and they then inform you that they've been tracking the combat data from your mission and have now used it to train new pilotless AI ship models for their fleet. And as a reward, you've been promoted 2 ranks and given the honor of being the first test of the new ship's firepower, to which they promptly light you up in a hail of artillery fire. So yeah, the moon, not exactly the good guys in this story. Nobody is really. And that's the point. War is bad. But you didn't think the game ended there, did you? No, of course not. Your pilot just re-emerges 1 month later in a new and improved Einhander, ready to take on its former allies. And this final level in space is pretty crazy, tons of tough enemies to get by, culminating in probably the most unique boss fight in the game, which features tons of weird perspective shifts. It's a great boss and it really lives up as the final climax for the game. Once you've beaten the boss, the game ends with you taking one final fight to the moon's army and pretty much succeeding in single-handedly taking out both the Earth and moon's military forces. You get it? Single-handedly? Einhander? Of course, you do eventually die, and the moon and Earth, being extra salty, pretty much erase your name from history, even as they both enter into a new era of peace, with only your name being whispered amongst the survivors of the Second Moon War. A melancholy ending, but a fitting one overall. Once again, it's not the greatest or most in-depth story you'll ever come across, but for a space shoot 'em up, this stuff is above and beyond what you'd expect to see in the genre. And I'd never want or expect to see a story in a game like this, but there's no arguing having it here just adds to the experience as a whole. And there's so much that I didn't even get to cover, like the game's fun scoring system, the fact that each level has 3 hidden bonus objectives for you to complete, like smashing all the lights in the opening level, and if you complete all 3 bonuses in a level, it will then take you to new extended areas within the levels. That's cool. There's even 2 bonus unlockable shifts, but you have to either find every bonus in the game or beat the game on hard without using a continue. And look, I don't hate myself enough to put myself through that, so I can't show them to you, but honestly, beating this game on normal is an accomplishment in itself, so that'll do me. So as you can see, even though Einhander is a relatively short game, taking about 50 to 60 minutes to beat, that doesn't take into consideration the amount of times you'll die, by the way. It still has a huge amount of replayability with trying to find all the bonuses and earning those extra ships. This is the kind of content you'd want to see in a game like this, and it's greatly appreciated. You also unlock a nice gallery upon completion if you want to delve into the game's world a bit more too. I probably sound like I'm just gushing over the game at this rate, but look, it's definitely not perfect. Some of the backgrounds can be very busy, which makes it hard to keep track of enemy fire, and the perspective shifts for the most part are fine, but some of them can be a bit jarring and off-putting if you're not prepared for them. This is especially true for the final level, where it's moving around pretty much constantly during the fight. And sometimes the hitboxes can be a little bit weird when you're trying to pick up weapons, and it can be really annoying losing out on something quite useful for an upcoming boss battle just because it didn't seem to want to stick to your ship. But look, these issues are few and far between, mostly just nitpicks in an otherwise fantastic experience. So if the game's this good, whatever happened to the series? Well, it's definitely got a lot of dedicated fans, but for whatever reason, this game never really rose to the same level of popularity as some of the generation's bigger shoot 'em ups. You'd be more likely to hear about any of the Saturn's biggest hits before you'd hear about Einhander, and maybe this has to do with the Saturn's reputation for being the shmup console of the era, rather than the PlayStation. You'd also think as it's a Square game, it might be a little bit more popular too, but this game is such a dramatic shift from what Square fans expected from the company, maybe it just never caught on with them either. Square, at least from a commercial level, have pretty much forgotten about the game too. There's never been any follow-ups or ports of the game, and as far as they're concerned, this game is pretty much it as far as their plans for the series go, which is pretty disappointing. But within Square itself, the game still has plenty of dedicated fans. Einhander references tend to pop up every now and then within other Square franchises. Parasite Eve 2 has an Einhander pinball table. World of Final Fantasy has Einhander as a boss and usable minion. The MMO Final Fantasy XIV features Einhander as a boss during one of its dungeons, and even though the design here is a little different, Einhander still picks up weapons off the ground to fight against you, which is a great touch. And the most recent and notable Einhander reference is in Kingdom Hearts 3 of all things, where the game director and noted Einhander fan Tetsuya Nomura actually got most of the Einhander dev team back to get together to work on the game's gummy ship segments. So if you're wondering why the gummy ships were extra good this time around, now you know. Also, of course you can play as Einhander and fight the Schwarzgeist as a secret boss too. Who'd have thought Kingdom Hearts 3 would be just Einhander fan service, but there you go. So look, Square clearly have no plans to bring Einhander back, and with shmups becoming more niche as the years pass, it becomes less and less likely over time that we'll ever see it again. But the dev team is still in Square, and the game's got plenty of high profile fans within Square itself, so I guess you never know. Time will tell. But for now, at least, we'll always have the PS1 original, a genre-defining entry in the PlayStation's library, a brutally difficult but incredibly fun video game that's dripping from head to toe in style and atmosphere. Maybe it's not the game for you, but I'd recommend everybody give it a try if they can, or at least give the soundtrack a spin. It's genuinely some of the best music on the console, and it's even a great listen as a standalone experience. Anyway, I should probably bring this video to a close, so as always, I appreciate you joining me to listen to me gush about a game that I really enjoy. And you can find more videos on the channel if you're looking for more PS1 content, but until next time, thank you so much for watching, glory with the moon, mercy on the earth.